Book 5, Chapter 13 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 13. The woodland path was deep in leaves. Claude and David were lying on the dry, springy heather among the flint boulders. Gerhardt, with his Stetson over his eyes, was presumably asleep. They were having fine weather for their holiday. The forest rose about this open glade like an amphitheater, in golden terraces of horse chestnut and beech. The big nuts dropped velvety and brown, as if they had been soaked in oil, and disappeared in the dry leaves below. Little black yew trees, that had not been visible in the green of summer, stood out among the curly yellow brakes. Through the gray netting of the beech twigs stiff holly bushes glittered. It was the Wheeler way to dread false happiness, to feel cowardly about being fooled. Since he had come back, Claude had more than once wondered whether he took too much for granted, and felt more at home here than he had any right to feel. The Americans were prone, he observed, to make themselves very much at home, to mistake good manners for good will. He had no right to doubt the affection of the Jouberts, however. That was genuine and personal, not a smooth surface under which almost any shade of scorn might lie and laugh, was not, in short, the treacherous French politeness by which one must not let oneself be taken in. Merely having seen the season change in a country gave one the sense of having been there for a long time, and anyway, he wasn't a tourist. He was here on legitimate business. Claude's sprained ankle was still badly swollen. Madame Joubert was sure he ought not to move about on it at all, begged him to sit in the garden all day and nurse it, but the surgeon at the front had told him that if he once stopped walking, he would have to go to the hospital. So, with the help of his host's best Hollywood cane, he limped out into the forest every day. This afternoon he was tempted to go still farther. Madame Joubert had told him about some caves at the other end of the wood, underground chambers where the country people had gone to live in times of great misery, long ago, in the English wars. The English wars. He could not remember just how far back they were, but long enough to make one feel comfortable. As for him, perhaps he would never go home at all. Perhaps when this great affair was over, he would buy a little farm and stay here for the rest of his life. That was a project he liked to play with. There was no chance for the kind of life he wanted at home, where people were always buying and selling, building and pulling down. He had begun to believe that the Americans were a people of shallow emotions. That was the way Gerhardt had put it once, and if it was true, there was no cure for it. Life was so short that it meant nothing at all unless it were continually reinforced by something that endured, unless the shadows of individual existence came and went against a background that held together. While he was absorbed in his daydream of farming in France, his companion stirred and rolled over on his elbow. "You know we are to join the battalion at A. They'll be living like kings there. Hicks will get so fat he'll drop over on the march. Headquarters must have something particularly nasty in mind. The infantry is always fed up before a slaughter. But I've been thinking, I have some old friends at A. Suppose we go on there a day early, and get them to take us in. It's a fine old place, and I ought to go to see them. The son was a fellow student of mine at the Conservatoire. He was killed the second winter of the war. I used to go up there for the holidays with him. I would like to see his mother and sister again. You've no objection?" Claude did not answer at once. He lay squinting off at the beech trees, without moving. "You always avoid that subject with me, don't you?" he said presently. "What subject?" "Oh, anything to do with the Conservatoire, or your profession." "I haven't any profession at present. I'll never go back to the violin." "You mean you couldn't make up for the time you'll lose?" Gerhardt settled his back against a rock and got out his pipe. "That would be difficult, but other things would be harder. I've lost much more than time." Couldn't you have got exemption, one way or another?" "I might have. My friends wanted to take it up and make a test case of me. But I couldn't stand for it. I didn't feel I was a good enough violinist to admit that I wasn't a man. I often wish I had been in Paris that summer when the war broke out. Then I would have gone into the French army on the first impulse, with the other students, and it would have been better." David paused and sat puffing at his pipe. Just then a soft movement stirred the brakes on the hillside. A little barefoot girl stood there, looking about. She had heard voices, but at first did not see the uniforms that blended with the yellow and brown of the wood. Then she saw the sun shining on two heads, one square and amber in color, the other reddish bronze, long and narrow. She took their friendliness for granted and came down the hill, stopping now and again to pick up shiny horse chestnuts and pop them into a sack she was dragging. David called to her and asked her whether the nuts were good to eat. "Oh, non!" she exclaimed, her face expressing the liveliest terror. "Pour les cochons! These inexperienced Americans might eat almost anything." The boys laughed and gave her some pennies. "Pour les cochons aussi!" She stole about the edge of the wood, stirring among the leaves for nuts and watching the two soldiers. Gerhardt knocked out his pipe and began to fill it again. "I went home to see my mother in May of 1914. I wasn't here when the war broke out. The Conservatoire closed at once, so I arranged a concert tour in the States that winter, and did very well. That was before all the little Russians went over, and the field wasn't so crowded. I had a second season, and that went well. But I was getting more nervous all the time. I was only half there." He smoked thoughtfully, sitting with folded arms, as if he were going over a succession of events or states of feeling. "When my number was drawn, I reported to see what I could do about getting out. I took a look at the other fellows who were trying to squirm, and chucked it. I've never been sorry. Not long afterward, my violin was smashed, and my career seemed to go along with it." Claude asked him what he meant. "While I was at Camp Dix, I had to play at one of the entertainments. My violin, a Stradivarius, was in a vault in New York. I didn't need it for that concert any more than I need it at this minute, yet I went to town and brought it out. I was taking it up from the station in a military car, and a drunken taxi driver ran into us. I wasn't hurt, but the violin, lying across my knees, was smashed into 1,000 pieces. I didn't know what it meant then, but since I've seen so many beautiful old things smashed, I've become a fatalist." Claude watched his brooding head against the gray flint rock. "You ought to have kept out of the whole thing. Any army man would say so." David's head went back against the boulder, and he threw one of the chestnuts lightly into the air. "Oh, one violinist more or less doesn't matter. But who is ever going back to anything? That's what I want to know." Claude felt guilty, as if David must have guessed what apostasy had been going on in his own mind this afternoon. "You don't believe we are going to get out of this war what we went in for, do you?" he asked suddenly. "Absolutely not," the other replied with cool indifference. "Then I certainly don't see what you're here for." "Because in 1917 I was 24 years old, and able to bear arms. The war was put up to our generation. I don't know what for. The sins of our fathers, probably. Certainly not to make the world safe for democracy, or any rhetoric of that sort. When I was doing stretcher work, I had to tell myself over and over that nothing would come of it, but that it had to be. Sometimes, though, I think something must. Nothing we expect, but something unforeseen." He paused and shut his eyes. "You remember in the old mythology tales how, when the sons of the gods were born, the mothers always died in agony? Maybe it's only Semele I'm thinking of. At any rate, I've sometimes wondered whether the young men of our time had to die to bring a new idea into the world, something Olympian. I'd like to know. I think I shall know. Since I've been over here this time, I've come to believe in immortality. Do you?" Claude was confused by this quiet question. "I hardly know. I've never been able to make up my mind." "Oh, don't bother about it. If it comes to you, it comes. You don't have to go after it. I arrived at it in quite the same way I used to get things in art, knowing them and living on them before I understood them. Such ideas used to seem childish to me." Gerhardt sprang up. "Now, have I told you what you want to know about my case?" He looked at Claude with a curious glimmer of amusement and affection. "I'm going to stretch my legs. It's 4 o'clock." He disappeared among the red pine stems, where the sunlight made a rose-colored lake, as it used to do in the summer, as it would do in all the years to come, when they were not there to see it, Claude was thinking. He pulled his hat over his eyes and went to sleep. The little girl on the edge of the beech wood left her sack and stole quietly down the hill. Sitting in the heather and drawing her feet up under her, she stayed still for a long time and regarded with curiosity the relaxed, deep-breathing body of the American soldier. The next day was Claude's 25th birthday, and in honor of that event, Papa Joubert produced a bottle of old Burgundy from his cellar, one of the few dozens he had laid in for great occasions when he was a young man. During that week of idleness at Madame Joubert's, Claude often thought that the period of happy youth about which his old friend Mrs. Erlich used to talk, and which he had never experienced, was being made up to him now. He was having his youth in France. He knew that nothing like this would ever come again. The fields and woods would never again be laced over this hazy enchantment. As he came up the village street in the purple evening, the smell of wood smoke from the chimneys went to his head like a narcotic, opened the pores of his skin, and sometimes made the tears come to his eyes. Life had, after all, turned out well for him, and everything had a noble significance. The nervous tension in which he had lived for years now seemed incredible to him, absurd and childish, when he thought of it at all. He did not torture himself with recollections. He was beginning over again. One night he dreamed that he was at home, out in the plowed fields, where he could see nothing but the furrowed brown earth stretching from horizon to horizon. Up and down it moved a boy, with a plow and 2 horses. At first he thought it was his brother Ralph, but on coming nearer, he saw it was himself, and he was full of fear for this boy. Poor Claude, he would never, never get away. He was going to miss everything. While he was struggling to speak to Claude and warn him, he awoke. In the years when he went to school in Lincoln, he was always hunting for someone whom he could admire without reservations, someone he could envy, emulate, wish to be. Now he believed that even then he must have had some faint image of a man like Gerhardt in his mind. It was only in war times that their paths would have been likely to cross, or that they would have had anything to do together. Any of the common interests that make men friends. End of Book 5, Chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss. Book 5, Chapter 14 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 14. Gerhardt and Claude Wheeler alighted from a taxi before the open gates of a square-roofed, solid-looking house, where all the shutters on the front were closed and the tops of many trees showed above the garden wall. They crossed a paved court and rang at the door. An old valet admitted the young men and took them through a wide hall to the salon, which opened on the garden. Madame and Mademoiselle would be down very soon. David went to one of the long windows and looked out. They have kept it up, in spite of everything. It was always lovely here. The garden was spacious, like a little park. On one side was a tennis court, on the other a fountain, with a pool and water lilies. The north wall was hidden by ancient yews. On the south, 2 rows of plane trees cut square made a long arbor. At the back of the garden there were fine old lindens. The gravel walks wound about beds of gorgeous autumn flowers. In the rose garden, small white roses were still blooming, though the leaves were already red. Two ladies entered the drawing-room. The mother was short, plump, and rosy, with strong, rather masculine features and yellowish white hair. The tears flashed into her eyes as David bent to kiss her hand, and she embraced him and touched both his cheeks with her lips. "Et vous, vous aussi," she murmured, touching the coat of his uniform with her fingers. There was but a moment of softness. She gathered herself up like an old general, Claude thought, as he stood watching the group from the window, drew her daughter forward, and asked David whether he recognized the little girl with whom he used to play. Mademoiselle Claire was not at all like her mother. Slender, dark, dressed in a white costume de tennis and an apple-green hat with black ribbons, she looked very modern and casual and unconcerned. She was already telling David she was glad he had arrived early, as now they would be able to have a game of tennis before tea. Maman would bring her knitting to the garden and watch them. This last suggestion relieved Claude's apprehension that he might be left alone with his hostess. When David called him and presented him to the ladies, Mademoiselle Claire gave him a quick handshake and said she would be very glad to try him out on the court as soon as she had beaten David. They would find tennis shoes in their room, a collection of shoes for the feet of all nations. Her brother's, some that his Russian friend had forgotten when he hurried off to be mobilized, and a pair lately left by an English officer who was quartered on them. She and her mother would wait in the garden. She rang for the old valet. The Americans found themselves in a large room upstairs, where two modern iron beds stood out conspicuous among heavy mahogany bureaus and desks and dressing tables, stuffed chairs and velvet carpets, and dull red brocade window hangings. David went at once into the little dressing room and began to array himself for the tennis court. 2 suits of flannels and a row of soft shirts hung there on the wall. "Aren't you going to change?" he asked, noticing that Claude stood stiff and unbending by the window, looking down into the garden. "Why should I?" said Claude scornfully. "I don't play tennis. I've never had a racket in my hand." "Too bad. She used to play very well, though she was only a youngster then." Gerhardt was regarding his legs in trousers 2 inches too short for him. How everything has changed, and yet how everything is still the same. It's like coming back to places in dreams. "They don't give you much time to dream, I should say," Claude remarked. "Fortunately." "Explain to the girl that I don't play, will you? I'll be down later." "As you like." Claude stood in the window, watching Gerhardt's bare head and Mademoiselle Claire's green hat and long brown arm go bounding about over the court. When Gerhardt came to change before tea, he found his fellow officer standing before his bag, which was open but not unpacked. "What's the matter? Feeling shell-shock again?" "Not exactly," Claude bit his lip. "The fact is, Dave, I don't feel just comfortable here. Oh, the people are all right, but I'm out of place. I'm going to pull out and get a billet somewhere else, and let you visit your friends in peace. Why should I be here? These people don't keep a hotel." "They very nearly do, from what they've been telling me. They've had a string of Scotch and English quartered on them. They like it, too, or have the good manners to pretend they do. Of course you'll do as you like, but you'll hurt their feelings and put me in an awkward position. To be frank, I don't see how you can go away without being distinctly rude." Claude stood looking down at the contents of his bag in an irresolute attitude. Catching a glimpse of his face in one of the big mirrors, Gerhardt saw that he looked perplexed and miserable. His flash of temper died, and he put his hand lightly on his friend's shoulder. "Come on, Claude, this is too absurd. You don't even have to dress, thanks to your uniform, and you don't have to talk, since you're not supposed to know the language. I thought you'd like coming here. These people have had an awfully rough time. Can't you admire their pluck?" "Oh, yes, I do. It's awkward for me, though." Claude pulled off his coat and began to brush his hair vigorously. "I guess I've always been more afraid of the French than of the Germans. It takes courage to stay, you understand. I want to run." "But why? What makes you want to?" "Oh, I don't know. Something in the house, in the atmosphere." "Something disagreeable?" "No, something agreeable." David laughed. "Oh, you'll get over that." They had tea in the garden, English fashion. English tea, too, Mademoiselle Claire informed them, left by the English officers. At dinner a third member of the family was introduced, a little boy with a cropped head and big black eyes. He sat on Claude's left, quiet and shy in his velvet jacket, though he followed the conversation eagerly, especially when it touched upon his brother Rene, killed at Verdun in the second winter of the war. The mother and sister talked about him as if he were living, about his letters and his plans, and his friends at the Conservatoire and in the army. Mademoiselle Claire told Gerhardt news of all the girl students he had known in Paris, how this one was singing for the soldiers, another, when she was nursing in a hospital which was bombed in an air raid, had carried 20 wounded men out of the burning building, one after another, on her back, like sacks of flour. Alice, the dancer, had gone into the English Red Cross and learned English. Odette had married a New Zealander, an officer who was said to be a cannibal. It was well known that his tribe had eaten 2 Auvergnat missionaries. There was a great deal more that Claude could not understand, but he got enough to see that for these women the war was France, the war was life, and everything that went into it. To be alive, to be conscious and have one's faculties, was to be in the war. After dinner, when they went into the salon, Madame Fleury asked David whether he would like to see Rene's violin again, and nodded to the little boy. He slipped away and returned carrying the case, which he placed on the table. He opened it carefully and took off the velvet cloth, as if this was his peculiar office, then handed the instrument to Gerhardt. David turned it over under the candles, telling Madame Fleury that he would have known it anyway, Rene's wonderful Amate, almost too exquisite in tone for the concert hall, like a woman who is too beautiful for the stage. The family stood round and listened to his praise with evident satisfaction. Madame Fleury told him that Lucien was très sérieux with his music, that his master was well pleased with him, and when his hand was a little larger he would be allowed to play upon Rene's violin. Claude watched the little boy as he stood looking at the instrument in David's hands. In each of his big black eyes a candle flame was reflected, as if some steady fire was actually burning there. "What is it, Lucien?" his mother asked. "If Monsieur David would be so good as to play before I must go to bed," he murmured entreatingly. "But, Lucien, I am a soldier now. I have not worked at all for 2 years. The Amate would think it had fallen into the hands of a Boche." Lucien smiled. "Oh, no, it is too intelligent for that. A little, please," and he sat down on a footstool before the sofa in confident anticipation. Mademoiselle Claire went to the piano. David frowned and began to tune the violin. Madame Fleury called the old servant and told him to light the sticks that lay in the fireplace. She took the armchair at the right of the hearth, and motioned Claude to a seat on the left. The little boy kept his stool at the other end of the room. Mademoiselle Claire began the orchestral introduction to the Saint-Saëns concerto. "Oh, not that!" David lifted his chin and looked at her in perplexity. She made no reply, but played on, her shoulders bent forward. Lucien drew his knees up under his chin and shivered. When the time came, the violin made its entrance. David had put it back under his chin mechanically, and the instrument broke into that suppressed, bitter melody. They played for a long while. At last David stopped and wiped his forehead. "I'm afraid I can't do anything with the third movement, really." "Nor can I. But that was the last thing Rene played on it, the night before he went away after his last leave." She began again, and David followed. Madame Fleury sat with half-closed eyes, looking into the fire. Claude, his lips compressed, his hands on his knees, was watching his friend's back. The music was a part of his own confused emotions. He was torn between generous admiration and bitter, bitter envy. What would it mean to be able to do anything as well as that, to have a hand capable of delicacy and precision and power? If he had been taught to do anything at all, he would not be sitting here tonight, a wooden thing amongst living people. He felt that a man might have been made of him, but nobody had taken the trouble to do it. Tongue-tied, foot-tied, hand-tied. If one were born into this world like a bear cub or a bull calf, one could only paw and upset things, break and destroy, all one's life. Gerhardt wrapped the violin up in its cloth. The little boy thanked him and carried it away. Madame Fleury and her daughter wished their guests good night. David said he was warm and suggested going into the garden to smoke before they went to bed. He opened one of the long windows and they stepped out on the terrace. Dry leaves were rustling down on the walks. The yew trees made a solid wall, blacker than the darkness. The fountain must have caught the starlight. It was the only shining thing, a little clear column of twinkling silver. The boys strolled in silence to the end of the walk. "I guess you'll go back to your profession, all right," Claude remarked, in the unnatural tone in which people sometimes speak of things they know nothing about. "Not I. Of course I had to play for them. Music has always been like a religion in this house. Listen." He put up his hand. Far away the regular pulsation of the big guns sounded through the still night. "That's all that matters now. It has killed everything else." "I don't believe it." Claude stopped for a moment by the edge of the fountain, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't believe it has killed anything. It has only scattered things." He glanced about hurriedly at the sleeping house, the sleeping garden, the clear, starry sky not very far overhead. "It's men like you that get the worst of it," he broke out. "But as for me, I never knew there was anything worth living for till this war came on. Before that, the world seemed like a business proposition." "You'll admit it's a costly way of providing adventure for the young," said David dryly. "Maybe so. All the same." Claude pursued the argument to himself long after they were in their luxurious beds and David was asleep. No battlefield or shattered country he had seen was as ugly as this world would be if men like his brother Bayliss controlled it altogether. Until the war broke out, he had supposed they did control it. His boyhood had been clouded and enervated by that belief. The Prussians had believed it too, apparently. But the event had shown that there were a great many people left who cared about something else. The intervals of the distant artillery fire grew shorter, as if the big guns were tuning up, choking to get something out. Claude sat up in his bed and listened. The sounds of the guns had from the first been pleasant to him, had given him a feeling of confidence and safety. Tonight he knew why. What they said was that men could still die for an idea, and would burn all they had made to keep their dreams. He knew the future of the world was safe. The careful planners would never be able to put it into a straitjacket. Cunning and prudence would never have it to themselves. Why, that little boy downstairs, with the candlelight in his eyes, when it came to the last cry, as they said, could carry on forever. Ideals were not archaic things, beautiful and impotent, they were the real sources of power among men. As long as that was true, and now he knew it was true, he had come all this way to find out. He had no quarrel with destiny. Nor did he envy David. He would give his own adventure for no man's. On the edge of sleep it seemed to glimmer, like the clear column of the fountain, like the new moon, alluring, half averted, the bright face of danger. End of Book 5, Chapter 14, recording by Tom Weiss. Book 5, Chapter 15 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 15. When Claude and David rejoined their battalion on the 20th of September, the end of the war looked as far away as ever. The collapse of Bulgaria was unknown to the American army, and their acquaintance with European affairs was so slight that this would have meant very little to them had they heard of it. The German army still held the north and east of France, and no one could say how much vitality was left in that sprawling body. The battalion entrained at Arras. Lieutenant Colonel Scott had orders to proceed to the railhead and then advance on foot into the Argonne. The cars were crowded, and the railway journey was long and fatiguing. They detrained at night, in the rain, at what the men said seemed to be the jumping-off place. There was no town, and the railway station had been bombed the day before, by an air fleet out to explode artillery ammunition. A mound of brick and holes full of water told where it had been. The Colonel sent Claude out with a patrol to find some place for the men to sleep. The patrol came upon a field of straw stacks, and at the end of it found a black farmhouse. Claude went up and hammered on the door. Silence. He kept hammering and calling, "The Americans are here!" A shutter opened. The farmer stuck his head out and demanded gruffly what was wanted. "What now?" Claude explained in his best French that an American battalion had just come in. Might they sleep in his field if they did not destroy his stacks? "Sure," replied the farmer, and shut the window. That one word, coming out of the dark in such an unpromising place, had a cheering effect upon the patrol and upon the men, when it was repeated to them. "Sure, eh?" They kept laughing over it as they beat about the field and dug into the straw. Those who couldn't burrow into a stack lay down in the muddy stubble. They were asleep before they could feel sorry for themselves. The farmer came out to offer his stable to the officers, and to beg them not on any account to make a light. They had never been bothered by air raids until yesterday, and it must be because the Americans were coming and were sending in ammunition. Gerhardt, who was called to talk to him, told the farmer the Colonel must study his map, and for that the man took them down into the cellar, where the children were asleep. Before he lay down on the straw bed his orderly had made for him, the Colonel kept telling names and kilometers off on his fingers. For officers like Colonel Scott, the names of places constituted one of the real hardships of the war. His mind worked slowly, but it was always on his job, and he could go without sleep for more hours together than any of his officers. Tonight he had scarcely lain down when a sentinel brought in a runner with a message. The Colonel had to go into the cellar again to read it. He was to meet Colonel Harvey at Prince Joachim Farm as early as possible tomorrow morning. The runner would act as guide. The Colonel sat with his eye on his watch and interrogated the messenger about the road and the time it would take to get over the ground. "What's Fritz's temper up here, generally speaking?" "That's as it happens, sir. Sometimes we nab a night patrol of a dozen or 15 and send them to the rear under a one-man guard. Then again, a little bunch of Heinies will fight like the devil. They say it depends on what part of Germany they come from. The Bavarians and Saxons are the bravest." Colonel Scott waited for an hour and then went about shaking his sleeping officers. "Yes, sir." Captain Maxey sprang to his feet as if he had been caught in a disgraceful act. He called his sergeants, and they began to beat the men up out of the straw stacks and puddles. In half an hour they were on the road. This was the battalion's first march over really bad roads, where walking was a question of pulling and balancing. They were soon warm at any rate. It kept them sweating. The weight of their equipment was continually thrown in the wrong place. Their wet clothing dragged them back, their packs got twisted and cut into their shoulders. Claude and Hicks began wondering to each other what it must have been like in the real mud, up about Ypres and Passchendaele 2 years ago. Hicks had been training at Arras last week, where a lot of the Tommies were resting in the same way, and he had tales to tell. The battalion got to Joachim Farm at 9 o'clock. Colonel Harvey had not yet come up, but old Julius Caesar was there with his engineers, and he had a hot breakfast ready for them. At 6 o'clock in the evening they took the road again, marching until daybreak with short rests. During the night they captured 2 Hun patrols, a bunch of 30 men. At the halt for breakfast, the prisoners wanted to make themselves useful, but the cook said they were so filthy the smell of them would make a stew go bad. They were herded off by themselves, a good distance from the grub line. It was Gerhardt, of course, who had to go over and question them. Claude felt sorry for the prisoners. They were so willing to tell all they knew, and so anxious to make themselves agreeable. Began talking about their relatives in America, and said brightly that they themselves were going over at once, after the war. Seemed to have no doubt that everybody would be glad to see them. They begged Gerhardt to be allowed to do something. Couldn't they carry the officers' equipment on the march? No, they were too buggy. They might relieve the sanitary squad. Oh, that they would gladly do, Herr Offizier. The plan was to get to Rupprecht Trench and take it before nightfall. It was easy taking. Empty of everything but vermin and human discards. A dozen crippled and sick, left for the enemy to dispose of, and several half-witted youths who ought to have been locked up in some institution. Fritz had known what it meant when his patrols did not come back. He had evacuated, leaving behind his hopelessly diseased and as much filth as possible. The dugouts were fairly dry, but so crawling with vermin that the Americans preferred to sleep in the mud in the open. After supper the men fell on their packs and began to lighten them, throwing away all that was not necessary, and much that was. Many of them abandoned the new overcoats that had been served out at the railhead. Others cut off the skirts and made the coats into ragged jackets. Captain Maxey was horrified at these depredations, but the Colonel advised him to shut his eyes. They've got hard going before them. Let them travel light. If they'd rather stand the cold, they've got a right to choose. End of Book 5, Chapter 15. Recording by Tom Weiss. Book 5, Chapter 16 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 16. The battalion had 24 hours rest at Rupprecht Trench, and then pushed on for 4 days and nights, stealing trenches, capturing patrols, with only a few hours' sleep, snatched by the roadside while their food was being prepared. They pushed hard after a retiring foe, and almost outran themselves. They did outrun their provisions. On the 4th night, when they fell upon a farm that had been a German headquarters, the supplies that were to meet them there had not come up, and they went to bed supperless. This farmhouse, for some reason called by the prisoners Frau Hulda Farm, was a nest of telephone wires. Hundreds of them ran out through the walls in all directions. The Colonel cut those he could find, and then put a guard over the old peasant who had been left in charge of the house, suspecting that he was in the pay of the enemy. At last Colonel Scott got into the headquarters bed, large and lumpy, the first one he had seen since he left Arras. He had not been asleep more than 2 hours when a runner arrived with orders from the regimental colonel. Claude was in a bed in the loft between Gerhardt and Bruger. He felt somebody shaking him, but resolved that he wouldn't be disturbed, and went on placidly sleeping. Then somebody pulled his hair, so hard that he sat up. Captain Maxey was standing over the bed. "Come along, boys. Orders from regimental headquarters. The battalion is to split here. Our company is to go on 4 kilometers tonight, and take the town of Beaufort." Claude rose. "The men are pretty well beat out, Captain Maxey, and they had no supper." "That can't be helped. Tell them we are to be in Beaufort for breakfast." Claude and Gerhardt went out to the barn and roused Hicks and his pal, Dell Able. The men were asleep in dry straw for the first time in 10 days. They were completely worn out, lost to time and place. Many of them were already 4,000 miles away, scattered among little towns and farms on the prairie. They were a miserable-looking lot as they got together, stumbling about in the dark. After the Colonel had gone over the map with Captain Maxey, he came out and saw the company assembled. He wasn't going with them, he told them, but he expected them to give a good account of themselves. Once in Beaufort, they would have a week's rest, sleep under cover, and live among people for a while. The men took the road, some with their eyes shut, trying to make believe they were still asleep, trying to have their agreeable dreams over again as they marched. They did not really waken up until the advance challenged a Hun patrol and sent it back to the colonel under a one-man guard. When they had advanced 2 kilometers, they found the bridge blown up. Claude and Hicks went in one direction to look for a ford, Bruger and Del Able in the other, and the men lay down by the roadside and slept heavily. Just at dawn they reached the outskirts of the village, silent and still. Captain Maxey had no information as to how many Germans might be left in the town. They had occupied it ever since the beginning of the war, and had used it as a rest camp. There had never been any fighting there. At the first house on the road the captain stopped and pounded. No answer. "We are Americans and must see the people of the house. If you don't open, we must break the door." A woman's voice called. "There is nobody here. Go away, please, and take your men away. I am sick." The captain called Gerhardt, who began to explain and reassure through the door. It opened a little way and an old woman in a nightcap peeped out. An old man hovered behind her. She gazed in astonishment at the officers, not understanding. These were the first soldiers of the Allies she had ever seen. She had heard the Germans talk about Americans, but thought it was one of their lies, she said. Once convinced, she let the officers come in and replied to their questions. No, there were no Boches left in her house. They had got orders to leave day before yesterday, and had blown up the bridge. They were concentrating somewhere to the east. She didn't know how many were still in the village, nor where they were, but she could tell the captain where they had been. Triumphantly she brought out a map of the town, lost, she said with a meaning smile, by a German officer, on which the billets were marked. With this to guide them, Captain Maxey and his men went on up the street. They took 8 prisoners in one cellar, 17 in another. When the villagers saw the prisoners bunched together in the square, they came out of their houses and gave information. This cleaning up, Bert Fuller remarked, was like taking fish from the Platte River when the water was low, simply paling them out. There was no sport in it. At 9 o'clock the officers were standing together in the square before the church, checking off on the map the houses that had been searched. The men were drinking coffee and eating fresh bread from a baker's shop. The square was full of people who had come out to see for themselves. Some believed that deliverance had come, and others shook their heads and held back, suspecting another trick. A crowd of children were running about, making friends with the soldiers. One little girl with yellow curls and a clean white dress had attached herself to Hicks, and was eating chocolate out of his pocket. Gerhardt was bargaining with the baker for another baking of bread. The sun was shining for a change. Everything was looking cheerful. This village seemed to be swarming with girls. Some of them were pretty, and all were friendly. The men who had looked so haggard and forlorn when dawn overtook them at the edge of the town began squaring their shoulders and throwing out their chests. They were dirty and mud-plastered, but as Claude remarked to the captain, they actually looked like fresh men. Suddenly a shot rang out above the chatter, and an old woman in a white cap screamed and tumbled over on the pavement, rolled about, kicking indecorously with both hands and feet. A second crack. The little girl who stood beside Hicks eating chocolate threw out her hands, ran a few steps, and fell, blood and brains oozing out in her yellow hair. The people began screaming and running. The Americans looked this way and that, ready to dash, but not knowing where to go. Another shot, and Captain Maxey fell on one knee, blushed furiously and sprang up, only to fall again, ashy white, with the leg of his trousers going red. "There it is, to the left!" Hicks shouted, pointing. They saw now. From a closed house some distance down a street off the square, smoke was coming. It hung before one of the upstairs windows. The captain's orderly dragged him into a wine shop. Claude and David, followed by the men, ran down the street and broke in the door. The two officers went through the rooms on the first floor, while Hicks and his lot made straight for an enclosed stairway at the back of the house. As they reached the foot of the stairs they were met by a volley of rifle shots, and two of the men tumbled over. 4 Germans were stationed at the head of the steps. The Americans scarcely knew whether their bullets or their bayonets got to the Huns first. They were not conscious of going up till they were there. When Claude and David reached the landing, the squad were wiping their bayonets, and 4 gray bodies were piled in the corner. Bert Fuller and Dell Able ran down the narrow hallway and threw open the door into the room on the street. 2 shots, and Dell came back with his jaw shattered and the blood spouting from the left side of his neck. Gerhardt caught him and tried to close the artery with his fingers. "How many are in there, Bert?" Claude called. "I couldn't see. Look out, sir, you can't get through that door more than 2 at a time." The door still stood open at the end of the corridor. Claude went down the steps until he could sight along the floor of the passage into the front room. The shutters were closed in there, and the sunlight came through the slats. In the middle of the room, between the door and the windows, stood a tall chest of drawers, with a mirror attached to the top. In the narrow space between the bottom of this piece of furniture and the floor, he could see a pair of boots. It was possible there was but one man in the room, shooting from behind his movable fort, though there might be others hidden in the corners. "There's only one fellow in there, I guess. He's shooting from behind a big dresser in the middle of the room. Come on, one of you. We'll have to go in and get him." Willy Katz, the Austrian boy from Omaha packing house, stepped up and stood beside him. "Now, Willy, we'll both go in at once. You jump to the right and I to the left, and one of us will jab him. He can't shoot both ways at once. Are you ready? All right, now!" Claude thought he was taking the more dangerous position himself, but the German probably reasoned that the important man would be on the right. As the 2 Americans dashed through the door, he fired. Claude caught him in the back with his bayonet, under the shoulder blade, but Willy Katz had got the bullet in his brain through one of his blue eyes. He fell and never stirred. The German officer fired his revolver again as he went down, shouting in English with no foreign accent, "You swine, go back to Chicago!" Then he began choking with blood. Sergeant Hicks ran in and shot the dying man through the temples. Nobody stopped him. The officer was a tall man, covered with medals and orders, must have been very handsome. His linen and his hands were as white as if he were going to a ball. On the dresser were the files and paste and buffers with which he had kept his nails so pink and smooth. A ring with a ruby, beautifully cut, was on his little finger. Bert Fuller screwed it off and offered it to Claude. He shook his head. That English sentence had unnerved him. Bert held the ring out to Hicks, but the sergeant threw down his revolver and broke out. "Think I'd touch anything of his? That beautiful little girl, and my buddy! He's worse than dead, Dell is, worse!" He turned his back on his comrade so that they wouldn't see him cry. "Can I keep it myself, sir?" Bert asked. Claude nodded. David had come in and was opening the shutters. This officer, Claude was thinking, was a very different sort of being from the poor prisoners they had been scooping up like tadpoles from the cellars. One of the men picked up a gorgeous silk dressing gown from the bed. Another pointed to a dressing case full of hammered silver. Gerhardt said it was Russian silver. This man must have come from the Eastern Front. Bert Fuller and Nifty Jones were going through the officers' pockets. Claude watched them, and thought they did about right. They didn't touch his medals, but his gold cigarette case and the platinum watch still ticking on his wrist. He wouldn't have further need for them. Around his neck, hung by a delicate chain, was a miniature case, and in it was a painting, not, as Bert romantically hoped when he opened it, of a beautiful woman, but of a young man, pale as snow, with blurred forget-me-not eyes. Claude studied it, wondering. It looks like a poet or something, probably a kid brother killed at the beginning of the war. Gerhardt took it and glanced at it with a disdainful expression. Probably. There, let him keep it, Bert. He touched Claude on the shoulder to call his attention to the inlay work on the handle of the officer's revolver. Claude noticed that David looked at him as if he were very much pleased with him, looked, indeed, as if something pleasant had happened in this room, where, God knew, nothing had, where, when they turned around, a swarm of black flies was quivering with greed and delight over the smears Willa Cather's body had left on the floor. Claude had often observed that when David had an interesting idea, or a strong twinge of recollection, it made him, for the moment, rather heartless. Just now he felt that Gerhardt's flash of high spirits was in some way connected with him. Was it because he had gone in with Willie? Had David doubted his nerve? End of Book 5, Chapter 16. Recording by Tom Weiss. Book 5, Chapter 17 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 17. When the survivors of Company B are old men, and are telling over their good days, they will say to each other, "Oh, that week we spent at Beaufort." They will close their eyes and see a little village on a low ridge, lost in the forest, overgrown with oak and chestnut and black walnut. Buried in autumn color, the streets, drifted deep in autumn leaves, great branches interlacing over the roofs of houses, wells of cool water that tastes of moss and tree roots. Up and down those streets they will see figures passing. Themselves, young and brown and clean-limbed, and comrades, long dead, but still alive in that far-away village. How they will wish they could tramp again, nights on days in the mud and rain, to drag sore feet into their old billets at Beaufort. To sink into those wide feather beds and sleep the round of the clock while the old women washed and dried their clothes for them. To eat rabbit stew and pommes frites in the garden, rabbit stew made with red wine and chestnuts. Oh, the days that are no more! As soon as Captain Maxey and the wounded men had been started on their long journey to the rear, carried by the prisoners, the whole company turned in and slept for 12 hours. All but Sergeant Hicks, who sat in the house off the square, beside the body of his chum. The next day the Americans came to life as if they were new men, just created in a new world. And the people of the town came to life. Excitement, change, something to look forward to at last. A new flag, le drapeau étoilé, floated along with the tricolor in the square. At sunset the soldiers stood in formation behind it, and sang the Star-Spangled Banner with uncovered heads. The old people watched them from the doorways. The Americans were the first to bring Madelon to Beaufort. The fact that the village had never heard this song, that the children stood around begging for it, Chantez-vous la Madone, made the soldiers realize how far and how long out of the world these villagers had been. The German occupation was like a deafness which nothing pierced but their own arrogant, martial airs. Before Claude was out of bed after his first long sleep, a runner arrived from Colonel Scott, notifying him that he was in charge of the company until further orders. The German prisoners had buried their own dead and dug graves for the Americans before they were sent off to the rear. Claude and David were billeted at the edge of town, with the woman who had given Captain Maxey his first information, when they marched in yesterday morning. Their hostess told them at their midday breakfast that the old dame who was shot in the square and the little girl were to be buried this afternoon. Claude decided that the Americans might as well have their funeral at the same time. He thought he would ask the priest to say a prayer at the graves, and he and David set off through the brilliant, rustling autumn sunshine to find the Cure's house. It was next to the church, with a high-walled garden behind it. Over the bell-pull in the outer wall was a card on which was written, "Très fort." The priest himself came out to them, an old man who seemed weak like his doorbell. He stood in his black cap holding his hands against his breast to keep them from shaking, and looked very old indeed. Broken, hopeless, as if he were sick of this world and done with it. Nowhere in France had Claude seen a face so sad as his. Yes, he would say a prayer. It was better to have Christian burial, and they were far from home, poor fellows. David asked him whether the German rule had been very oppressive, but the old man did not answer clearly, and his hands began to shake so uncontrollably over his cassock that they went away to spare him embarrassment. "He seems a little gone in his head, don't you think?" Claude remarked. "I suppose the war has used him up. How can he celebrate Mass when his hands quiver so?" As they crossed the church steps, David touched Claude's arm and pointed into the square. "Look, every doughboy has a girl already. Some of them have trotted out fatigue caps. I supposed they'd thrown them all away." Those who had no caps stood with their helmets under their arms, in attitudes of exaggerated gallantry, talking to the women, who seemed all to have errands abroad. Some of them let the boys carry their baskets. One soldier was giving a delighted little girl a ride on his back. After the funeral, every man in the company found some sympathetic woman to talk to about his fallen comrades. All the garden flowers and bead wreaths in Beaufort had been carried out and put on the American graves. When the squad fired over them and the bugle sounded, the girls and their mothers wept. Poor Willa Cather, for instance, could never have had such a funeral in South Omaha. The next night the soldiers began teaching the girls to dance the pas seul and the fostro. They had found an old violin in the town, and Oscar the Swede scraped away on it. They danced every evening. Claude saw that a good deal was going on, and he lectured his men at parade. But he realized that he might as well scold at the sparrows. Here was a village with several hundred women, and only the grandmothers had husbands. All the men were in the army, hadn't even been home on leave since the Germans first took the place. The girls had been shut up for 4 years with young men who incessantly coveted them, and with whom they must constantly outwit. The situation had been intolerable and prolonged. The Americans found themselves in the position of Adam in the garden. "Did you know, sir," said Bert Fuller breathlessly as he overtook Claude in the street after parade, "that these lovely girls had to go out in the fields and work, raising things for those dirty pigs to eat? Yes, sir, had to work in the fields under German sentinels, marched out in the morning and back at night, like convicts. It's sure up to us to give them a good time now." One couldn't walk out of an evening without meeting loitering couples in the dusky streets and lanes. The boys had lost all their bashfulness about trying to speak French. They declared they could get along in France with 3 verbs, and all happily in their first conjugation. Manger, aimer, payer. Quite enough. They called Beaufort our town, and they were called our Americans. They were going to come back after the war and marry the girls, and put in waterworks. "Chez moi, sir," Bill Gates called to Claude, saluting with a bloody hand, as he stood skinning rabbits before the door of his billet. "Bunny casualties are heavy in town this week." "You know, Wheeler," David remarked one morning as they were shaving, "I think Maxie would come back here on one leg if he knew about these excursions into the forest after mushrooms." "Maybe." "Aren't you going to put a stop to them?" "Not I," Claude jerked, setting the corners of his mouth grimly. "If the girls or their people make complaint to me, I'll interfere. Not otherwise. I've thought the matter over." "Oh, the girls," David laughed softly. "Well, it's something to acquire a taste for mushrooms. They don't get them at home, do they?" When after 8 days the Americans had orders to march, there was mourning in every house. On their last night in town, the officers received pressing invitations to the dance in the square. Claude went for a few moments and looked on. David was dancing every dance, but Hicks was nowhere to be seen. The poor fellow had been out of everything. Claude went over to the church to see whether he might be moping in the graveyard. There, as he walked about, Claude stopped to look at the grave that stood off by itself, under a privet hedge with withered leaves and a little French flag on it. The old woman with whom they stayed had told them the story of this grave. The Cure's niece was buried there. She was the prettiest girl in Beaufort, it seemed, and she had a love affair with a German officer, and disgraced the town. He was a young Bavarian, quartered with this same old woman who told them the story, and she said he was a nice boy, handsome and gentle, and used to sit up half the night in the garden with his head in his hands, homesick, lovesick. He was always after this Marie Louise, never pressed her, but was always there, grew up out of the ground under her feet, the old woman said. The girl hated Germans like all the rest, and flouted him. He was sent to the front. Then he came back, sick and almost deaf, after one of the slaughters at Verdun, and stayed a long while. That spring a story got about that some woman met him at night in the German graveyard. The Germans had taken the land behind the church for their cemetery, and it joined the wall of the Cure's garden. When the woman went out into the fields to plant the crops, Marie Louise used to slip away from the others and meet her Bavarian in the forest. The girls were sure of it now, and they treated her with disdain. But nobody was brave enough to say anything to the Cure. One day, when she was with her Bavarian in the wood, she snatched up his revolver from the ground and shot herself. She was a Frenchwoman at heart, their hostess said. And the Bavarian? Claude asked David later. The story had become so complicated he could not follow it. He justified her, and promptly. He took the same pistol and shot himself through the temples. His orderly, stationed at the edge of the thicket to keep watch, heard the first shot and ran toward them. He saw the officer take up the smoking pistol and turn it on himself. But the Commandant couldn't believe that one of his officers had so much feeling. He held an enquête, dragged the girl's mother and uncle into court, and tried to establish that they were in conspiracy with her to seduce and murder a German officer. The orderly was made to tell the whole story, how and where they began to meet. Though he wasn't very delicate about the details he divulged, he stuck to his statement that he saw Lieutenant Muller shoot himself with his own hand, and the Commandant failed to prove his case. The old Cure had known nothing of all this until he heard it aired in the military court. Marie Louise had lived in his house since she was a child, and was like his daughter. He had a stroke or something, and has been like this ever since. The girl's friends forgave her, and when she was buried off alone by the hedge, they began to take flowers to her grave. The Commandant put up an affiche on the hedge, forbidding anyone to decorate the grave. Apparently nothing during the German occupation stirred up more feeling than poor Marie Louise. It would stir anybody, Claude reflected. There was her lonely little grave, the shadow of the privet hedge falling across it. There, at the foot of the Cure's garden, was the German cemetery, with heavy cement crosses, some of them with long inscriptions, lines from their poets and couplets from old hymns. Lieutenant Muller was there somewhere, probably. Strange how their story stood out in a world of suffering. That was a kind of misery he hadn't happened to think of before, but the same thing must have occurred again and again in occupied territory. He would never forget the Cure's hands, his dim, suffering eyes. Claude recognized David crossing the pavement in front of the church, and went back to meet him. "Hello! I mistook you for Hicks at first. I thought he might be out here." David sat down on the steps and lit a cigarette. "So did I. I came out to look for him." "Oh, I expect he's found some shoulder to cry on." "Do you realize, Claude, you and I are the only men in the company who haven't got engaged? Some of the married men have got engaged twice. It's a good thing we're pulling out, or we'd have bonds and a bunch of christenings to look after." "All the same," murmured Claude, "I like the women of this country as far as I've seen them." While they sat smoking in silence, His mind went back to the quiet scene he had watched on the steps of that other church on his first night in France. The country girl in the moonlight, bending over her sick soldier. When they walked back across the square, over the crackling leaves, the dance was breaking up. Oscar was playing Home, Sweet Home for the last waltz. "Le dernier baiser," said David. "Well, tomorrow we'll be gone, and the chances are we won't come back this way." End of Book 5, Chapter 17. Recording by Tom Weiss. Book 5, Chapter 18 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 18. With us it's always a feast or a famine, the men groaned, when they sat down by the road to munch dry biscuit at noon. They had covered 18 miles that morning, and had still 7 more to go. They were ordered to do the 25 miles in 8 hours. Nobody had fallen out, yet, but some of the boys looked pretty well wilted. Nifty Jones said he was done for. Sergeant Hicks was expostulating with the faint-hearted. He knew that if one man fell out, a dozen would. "If I can do it, you can. It's worse on a fat man like me. This is no march to make a fuss about. Why, at Arras I talked with a little Tommy from one of those PAL battalions that got slaughtered on the Somme. His battalion marched 25 miles in 6 hours, in the heat of July, into certain death. They were all kids out of school, not a man of them over 5'3". Called them the Bantams. You've got to hand it to them, fellows. I'll hand anything to anybody, but I can't go no further on these," Jones muttered, nursing his sore feet. "Oh, you! We're going to heave you onto the only horse in the company. The officers, they can walk." When they got into battalion lines there was food ready for them, but very few wanted it. They drank and lay down in the bushes. Claude went at once to headquarters and found Barclay Owens of the Engineers with the Colonel, who was smoking and studying his maps as usual. "Glad to see you, Wheeler. Your men ought to be in good shape after a week's rest. Let them sleep now. We've got to move out of here before midnight to relieve 2 Texas battalions at Moltke Trench. They've taken the trench with heavy casualties and are beat out. Couldn't hold it in case of counterattack. As it's an important point, the enemy will try to recover it. I want to get into position before daylight, so he won't know fresh troops are coming in. As ranking officer, you are in charge of the company." "Very well, sir. I'll do my best." "I'm sure you will. 2 machine-gun teams are going up with us, and sometime tomorrow a Missouri battalion comes up to support. I'd have had you over here before, but I only got my orders to relieve yesterday. We may have to advance under shell fire. The enemy has been putting a lot of big stuff over. He wants to cut off that trench." Claude and David got into a fresh shell hole under the half-buried scrub and fell asleep. They were awakened at dusk by heavy artillery fire from the north. At 10 o'clock the battalion, after a hot meal, began to advance through almost impassable country. The guns must have been pounding away at the same range for a long while. The ground was worked and kneaded until it was soft as dough, though no rain had fallen for a week. Barclay Owens and his engineers were throwing down a plank road to get food and the ammunition wagons across. Big shells were coming over at intervals of 12 minutes. The intervals were so regular that it was quite possible to get forward without damage. While B Company was pulling through the shell area, Colonel Scott overtook them, on foot, his orderly leading his horse. "You know anything about that light over there, Wheeler?" he asked. "Well, it oughtn't to be there. Come along and see." The light was a mere match-head down in the ground. Claude hadn't noticed it before. He followed the Colonel, and when they reached the spark they found 3 officers of A Company crouching in a shell crater, covered with a piece of sheet iron. "Put out that light," called the Colonel sharply. "What's the matter, Captain Brace?" A young man rose quickly. "I'm waiting for the water, sir. It's coming up on mules, in petrol cases, and I don't want to get separated from it. The ground's so bad here the drivers are likely to get lost." "Don't wait more than 20 minutes. You must get up and take your position on time. That's the important thing. Water or no water." As the Colonel and Claude hurried back to overtake the company, 5 big shells screamed over them in rapid succession. "Run, sir!" the orderly called. "They're getting on to us. They've shortened the range." "That light back there was just enough to give them an idea," the Colonel muttered. The bad ground continued for about a mile, and then the advance reached headquarters, behind the 8th trench of the great system of trenches. It was an old farmhouse which the Germans had made over with reinforced concrete, lining it within and without until the walls were 6 feet thick and almost shell-proof, like a pillbox. The Colonel sent his orderly to inquire about A Company. A young lieutenant came to the door of the farmhouse. "A Company is ready to go into position, sir. I brought them up." "Where is Captain Brace, Lieutenant?" "He and both our first lieutenants were killed, Colonel. Back in that hole. A shell fell on them not 5 minutes after you were talking to them." "That's bad. Any other damage?" "Yes, sir. There was a cook wagon struck at the same time. The first one coming along Julius Caesar's new road. The driver was killed, and we had to shoot the horses. Captain Owens, he near got scalded with the stew." The Colonel called in the officers one after another and discussed their positions with them. "Wheeler," he said when Claude's turn came, "you know your map? You've noticed that sharp loop in the front trench, in H2, the Boar's Head, I believe they call it. It's sort of a spear point that reaches out toward the enemy, and it will be a hot place to hold. If I put your company in there, do you think you can do the battalion credit in case of a counterattack?" Claude said he thought so. "It's the nastiest bit of the line to hold, and you can tell your men I pay them a compliment when I put them there." "All right, sir. They'll appreciate it." The Colonel bit off the end of a fresh cigar. "They'd better, by thunder! If they give way and let the Hun bombers in, it will let down the whole line. I'll give you 2 teams of Georgia machine guns to put in that point they call the Boar's Snout. When the Missourians come up tomorrow, they'll go in to support you, but until then you'll have to take care of the loop yourselves. I've got an awful lot of trench to hold, and I can't spare you any more men." The Texas men whom the battalion came up to relieve had been living for 60 hours on their iron rations, and on what they could pick off the dead Huns. Their supplies had been shelled on the way, and nothing had got through to them. When the Colonel took Claude and Gerhardt forward to inspect the loop that B Company was to hold, they found a wallow, more like a dump heap than a trench. The men who had taken the position were almost too weak to stand. All their officers had been killed, and a sergeant was in command. He apologized for the condition of the loop. "Sorry to leave such a mess for you to clean up, sir, but we got it bad in here. He's been shelling us every night since we drove him out. I couldn't ask the men to do anything but hold on." "That's all right. You beat it with your boys, quick. My men will hand out some grub as you go back." The battered defenders of the Boar's Head stumbled past them through the darkness into the communication. When the last man had filed out, the Colonel sent for Barclay Owens. Claude and David tried to feel their way about and get some idea of the condition the place was in. The stench was the worst they had yet encountered, but it was less disgusting than the flies. When they inadvertently touched a dead body, clouds of wet, buzzing flies flew up into their faces, into their eyes and nostrils. Under their feet the earth worked and moved as if boa constrictors were wriggling down their soft bodies, lightly covered. When they had found their way up to the Snout, they came upon a pile of corpses, a dozen or more, thrown one on top of another like sacks of flour, faintly discernible in the darkness. While the 2 officers stood there, rumbling, squirting sounds began to come from this heap, first from one body, then from another, gases swelling in the liquefying entrails of the dead men. They seemed to be complaining to one another. Glup, glup, glup. The boys went back to the Colonel, who was standing at the mouth of the communication, and told him there was nothing much to report, except that the burying squad was needed badly. "I expect." The Colonel shook his head. When Barclay Owens arrived, he asked him what could be done here before daybreak. The doughty engineer felt his way about as Claude and Gerhardt had done. They heard him coughing and beating off the flies. But when he came back, he seemed rather cheered than discouraged. "Give me a gang to get the casualties out, and with plenty of quicklime and concrete, I can make this loop all right in 4 hours, sir," he declared. "I've brought plenty of lime, but where'll you get your concrete?" "The Hun left about 50 sacks of it in the cellar under your headquarters. I can do better, of course, if I have a few hours more for my concrete to dry." "Go ahead, Captain." The Colonel told Claude and David to bring their men up to the communication before light, and hold them ready. "Give Owens' cement a chance, but don't let the enemy put over any surprise on you." The shelling began again at daybreak. It was hardest on the rear trenches and the 3-mile area behind. Evidently the enemy felt sure of what he had in Moltke Trench. He wanted to cut off supplies and possible reinforcements. The Missouri Battalion did not come up that day, but before noon a runner arrived from their colonel, with information that they were hiding in the wood. 5 Boche planes had been circling over the wood since dawn, signaling to the enemy headquarters back on Dauphin Ridge. The Missourians were sure they had avoided detection by lying close in the underbrush. They would come up in the night. Their linemen were following the runner, and Colonel Scott would be in telephone communication with them in half an hour. When B Company moved into the Boar's Head at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they could truthfully say that the prevailing smell was now that of quicklime. The parapet was evenly built up, the firing step had been partly restored, and in the Snout there were good emplacements for the machine guns. Certain unpleasant reminders were still to be found if one looked for them. In the Snout a large fat boot stuck stiffly from the side of the trench. Captain Owens explained that the ground sounded hollow in there, and the boot probably led back into a dugout where a lot of Hun bodies were entombed together. As he was pressed for time, he had thought it best not to look for trouble. In one of the curves of the loop, just at the top of the earth wall, under the sandbags, a dark hand reached out. The 5 fingers, well apart, looked like the swollen roots of some noxious weed. Hicks declared that this object was disgusting, and during the afternoon he made Nifty Jones and Oscar scrape down some earth and make a hump over the paw. But there was shelling in the night, and the earth fell away. "Look," said Jones when he wakened his sergeant. "The first thing I seen when daylight come was his old fingers wigglin' in the breeze. He wants air, Heinie does. He won't stay covered." Hicks got up and reburied the hand himself, but when he came around with Claude on inspection before breakfast, there were the same 5 fingers sticking out again. The sergeant's forehead puffed up and got red, and he swore that if he found the man who played dirty jokes, he'd make him eat this one. The Colonel sent for Claude and Gerhardt to come to breakfast with him. He had been talking by telephone with Missouri officers, and had agreed that they should stay back in the bush for the present. The continual circling of planes over the wood seemed to indicate that the enemy was concerned about the actual strength of Moltke Trench. It was possible their air scouts had seen the Texas men going back. Otherwise, why were they holding off? While the Colonel and the officers were at breakfast, a corporal brought in 2 pigeons he had shot down at dawn. One of them carried a message under its wing. The Colonel unrolled a strip of paper and handed it to Gerhardt. "Yes, sir. It's in German, but it's code stuff. It's a German nursery rhyme. Those reconnoitering planes must have dropped scouts on our rear, and they are sending in reports. Of course, they can get more on us than the airmen can. Here, do you want these birds, Dick?" The boy grinned. "You bet I do, sir. I may get a chance to fry 'em later on." After breakfast, the Colonel went to inspect B Company in the Boar's Head. He was especially pleased with the advantageous placing of the machine guns in the Snout. "I expect you'll have a quiet day," he said to the men, "but I wouldn't like to promise you a quiet night. You have to be very steady in here. If Fritz takes this loop, he's got us, you understand?" They had, indeed, a quiet day. Some of the men played cards, and Oscar read his Bible. That night, too, began well. But at 4:15 everybody was roused by the gas alarm. Gas shells came over for exactly half an hour. Then the shrapnel broke loose. Not the long, whizzing scream of solitary shells, but drum fire, continuous and deafening. 100 electrical storms seemed raging at once in the air and on the ground. Balls of fire were rolling all over the place. The range was a little long for the Boar's Head. They were not getting the worst of it, but 30 yards back everything was torn to pieces. Claude didn't see how anybody could be left alive back there. A single twister had killed 6 of his men at the rear of the loop, where they were shoveling to keep the communication clear. Captain Owen's neat earthworks were being badly pounded. Claude and Gerhardt were consulting together when the smoke and darkness began to take on the livid color that announced the coming of daybreak. A messenger ran in from the Colonel. The Missourians had not yet come up, and his telephone communication with them was cut off. He was afraid they had got lost in the bombardment. "The Colonel says you are to take 2 men back to bring them up, 2 men who can take charge if they're stampeded." When the messenger shouted this order, Gerhardt and Hicks looked at each other quickly, and volunteered to go. Claude hesitated. Hicks and David waited for no further consent. They ran down the communication and disappeared. Claude stood in the smoke that was slowly growing grayer, and looked after them with the deepest stab of despair he had ever known. Only a man who was bewildered and unfit to be in command of other men would have let his best friend and his best officer take such a risk. He was standing there under shelter, and his 2 friends were going back through that curtain of flying steel, toward the square from which the lost battalion had last reported. If he knew them, they would not lose time following the maze of trenches. They were probably even now out on the open, running straight through the enemy barrage, vaulting trench tops. Claude turned and went back into the loop. Well, whatever happened, he had worked with brave men. It was worth having lived in this world to have known such men. Soldiers, when they were in a tight place, often made secret propositions to God. And now he found himself offering terms. If they would see to it that David came back, they could take the price out of him. He would pay. Did they understand? An hour dragged by, hard on the nerves, waiting. Up the communication came a train with ammunition and coffee for the loop. The men thought headquarters did pretty well to get hot food to them through that barrage. A message came up in the Colonel's hand. "Be ready when the barrage stops." Claude took this up and showed it to the machine gunners in the Snout. Turning back, he ran into Hicks, stripped to his shirt and trousers, as wet as if he had come out of the river, and splashed with blood. His hand was wrapped up in a rag. He put his mouth to Claude's ear and shouted, "We found them! They were lost! They're coming! Send word to the Colonel!" "Where's Gerhardt?" "He's coming, bringing them up." "God, it's stopped!" The bombardment ceased with a suddenness that was stupefying. The men in the loop gasped and crouched as if they were falling from a height. The air, rolling black with smoke and stifling with the smell of gases and burning powder, was still as death. The silence was like a heavy anesthetic. Claude ran back to the Snout to see that the machine gun teams were ready. "Wake up, boys! You know why we're here." Bert Fuller, who was up in the lookout, dropped back into the trench beside him. "They're coming, sir." Claude gave the signal to the machine guns. Fire opened all along the loop. In a moment a breeze sprang up, and the heavy smoke clouds drifted to the rear. Mounting to the fire step, he peered over. The enemy was coming on 8 deep, on the left of the Boar's Head, in long, waving lines that reached out toward the main trench. Suddenly the advance was checked. The files of running men dropped behind a wrinkle in the earth 50 yards forward, and did not instantly reappear. It struck Claude that they were waiting for something. He ought to be clever enough to know for what. But he was not. The Colonel's line man came up to him. "Headquarters has a runner from the Missourians. They'll be up in 20 minutes. The Colonel will put them in here at once. Till then, you must manage to hold." "We'll hold. Fritz is behaving queerly. I don't understand his tactics." While he was speaking, everything was explained. The boar's snout spread apart with an explosion that split the earth and went up in a volcano of smoke and flame. Claude and the Colonel's messenger were thrown on their faces. When they got to their feet, the snout was a smoking crater full of dead and dying men. The Georgia gun teams were gone. It was for this that the Hun advance had been waiting behind the ridge. The mine under the Snout had been made long ago, probably on a venture when the Hun held Moltke Trench for months without molestation. During the last 24 hours they had been getting their explosives in, reasoning that the strongest garrison would be placed there. Here they were, coming on the run. It was up to the rifles. The men who had been knocked down by the shock were all on their feet again. They looked at their officer questioningly, as if the whole situation had changed. Claude felt they were going soft under his eyes. In a moment the Hun bombers would be in on them, and they would break. He ran along the trench, poring over the sandbags and shouting, "It's up to you! It's up to you!" The rifles recovered themselves and began firing, but Claude felt they were spongy and uncertain, that their minds were already on their way to the rear. If they did anything, it must be quick, and their gun work must be accurate. Nothing but a withering fire could check. He sprang to the fire step, and then out on the parapet. Something instantaneous happened. He had his men in hand. "Steady! Steady!" He called the range to the rifle teams behind him, and he could see the fire take effect. All along the Hun lines men were stumbling and falling. They swerved a little to the left. He called the rifles to follow, directing them with his voice and with his hands. It was not only that from here he could correct the range and direct the fire. The men behind him had become like rock. That line of faces below, Hicks, Jones, Fuller, Anderson, Oscar, their eyes never left him. With these men he could do anything. The right of the Hun line swerved out, not more than 20 yards from the battered Snout, trying to run to shelter under that pile of debris and human bodies. A quick concentration of rifle fire depressed it, and the swell came out again toward the left. Claude's appearance on the parapet had attracted no attention from the enemy at first, but now the bullets began popping about him. 2 rattled on his twin hat, 1 caught him in the shoulder. The blood dripped down his coat, but he felt no weakness. He felt only one thing, that he commanded wonderful men. When David came up with the supports, he might find them dead, but he would find them all there. They were there to stay until they were carried out to be buried. They were mortal, but they were unconquerable. The Colonel's 20 minutes must almost be up, he thought. He couldn't take his eyes from the front line long enough to look at his wristwatch. The men behind him saw Claude sway, as if he had lost his balance and were trying to recover it. Then he plunged face down outside the parapet. Hicks caught his foot and pulled him back. At the same moment the Missourians ran yelling up the communication. They threw their machine guns up on the sandbags and went into action without an unnecessary motion. Hicks and Bert Fuller and Oscar carried Claude forward toward the Snout, out of the way of the supports that were pouring in. He was not bleeding very much. He smiled at them as if he were going to speak, but there was a weak blankness in his eyes. Bert tore his shirt open, 3 clean bullet holes. By the time they looked at him again, the smile had gone. The look that was Claude had faded. Hicks wiped the sweat and smoke from his officer's face. "Thank God I never told him," he said. "Thank God for that." Bert and Oscar knew what Hicks meant. Gerhardt had been blown to pieces at his side when they dashed back through the enemy barrage to find the Missourians. They were running together across the open, not able to see much for smoke. They bumped into a section of wire entanglement, left above an old trench. David cut round to the right, waving Hicks to follow him. The two were not 10 yards apart when the shell struck. Then Sergeant Hicks ran on alone. End of Book 5, Chapter 18. Recording by Tom Weiss. Book 5, Chapter 19 of One of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. One of Ours by Willa Cather. Chapter 19. The sun is sinking low. A transport is steaming slowly up the Narrows with the tide. The decks are covered with brown men. They cluster over the superstructure like bees in swarming time. Their attitudes are relaxed and lounging. Some look thoughtful, some well-contented, some are melancholy, and many are indifferent as they watch the shore approaching. They are not the same men who went away. Sergeant Hicks was standing in the stern, smoking, reflecting, watching the twinkle of the red sunset upon the cloudy water. He is more than a year since he sailed for France. The world has changed in that time, and so has he. Bert Fuller elbowed his way up to the sergeant. "The doctor says Colonel Maxey is dying. He won't live to get off the boat, much less to ride in the parade in New York tomorrow." Hicks shrugged, as if Maxey's pneumonia were of no affair of his. "Well, we should worry. We've left better officers than him over there." "I'm not saying we haven't, but it seems too bad, when he's so strong for fuss and feathers. He's been sending cables about that parade for weeks." "Huh!" Hicks elevated his eyebrows and glanced sideways in disdain. Presently he sputtered, squinting down at the glittering water. "Colonel Maxey, anyhow. Colonel for what Claude and Gerhardt did, I guess. Hicks and Bert Fuller have been helping to keep the noble fortress of Ehrenbreitstein. They have always hung together, and are usually quarreling and grumbling at each other when they are off duty. Still, they hang together. They are the last of their group. Nifty Jones and Oscar, God only knows why, have gone on to the Black Sea." During the year they were in the Rhine Valley, Bert and Hicks were separated only once, and that was when Hicks got a 2 weeks' leave and, by dint of persevering and fatiguing travel, went to Venice. He had no proper passport, and the consuls and officials to whom he had appealed in his difficulties begged him to content himself with something nearer. But he said he was going to Venice because he had always heard about it. Bert Fuller was glad to welcome him back to Koblenz, and gave him a wine party to celebrate his return. They expect to keep an eye on each other. Though Bert lives on the Platte and Hicks on the Big Blue, the automobile roads between those two rivers are excellent. Bert is the same sweet-tempered boy he was when he left his mother's kitchen. His gravest troubles have been frequent betrothals. But Hicks' round, chubby face has taken on a slightly cynical expression, a look quite out of place there. The chances of war have hurt his feelings. Not that he ever wanted anything for himself. The way in which glittering honors bump down upon the wrong heads in the army, and palms and crosses blossom on the wrong breasts, has, as he says, thrown his compass off a few points. What Hicks had wanted most in this world was to run a garage and repair shop with his old chum, Dell Able. Beaufort ended all that. He means to conduct a sort of memorial shop, anyhow, with Hicks and Able over the door. He wants to roll up his sleeves and look at the logical and beautiful inwards of automobiles for the rest of his life. As the transport enters the North River, sirens and steam whistles all along the waterfront begin to blow their shrill salute to the returning soldiers. The men square their shoulders and smile knowingly at one another. Some of them look a little bored. Hicks slowly lights a cigarette and regards the end of it with an expression which will puzzle his friends when he gets home. By the banks of Lovely Creek, where it began, Claude Wheeler's story still goes on. To the two old women who work together in the farmhouse, the thought of him is always there, beyond everything else, at the farthest edge of consciousness, like the evening sun on the horizon. Mrs. Wheeler got the word of his death one afternoon in the sitting-room, the room in which he had bade her good-bye. She was reading when the telephone rang. "Is this the Wheeler farm?" "This is the telegraph office at Frankfort. We have a message from the War Department." The voice hesitated. "Isn't Mr. Wheeler there?" "No, but you can read the message to me." Mrs. Wheeler said, "Thank you," and hung up the receiver. She felt her way softly to her chair. She had an hour alone, when there was nothing but him in the room, but him and the map there, which was the end of his road. Somewhere among those perplexing names he had found his place. Claude's letters kept coming for weeks afterwards. Then came the letters from his comrades and his Colonel to tell her all. In the dark months that followed, when human nature looked to her uglier than it had ever done before, those letters were Mrs. Wheeler's comfort. As she read the newspapers, she used to think about the passage of the Red Sea in the Bible. It seemed as if the flood of meanness and greed had been held back just long enough for the boys to go over, and then swept down and engulfed everything that was left at home. When she can see nothing that has come of it all but evil, she reads Claude's letters over again and reassures herself. For him the call was clear, the cause was glorious. Never a doubt stained his bright faith. She divines so much that he did not write. She knows what to read into those short flashes of enthusiasm. How fully he must have found his life before he could let himself go so far. He who was so afraid of being fooled. He died believing his own country better than it is, and France better than any country can ever be. And those were beautiful beliefs to die with. Perhaps it was as well to see that vision, and then to see no more. She would have dreaded the awakening. She sometimes even doubts whether he could have borne at all that last desolating disappointment. One by one the heroes of that war, the men of dazzling soldiership, leave prematurely the world they have come back to. Airmen whose deeds were tales of wonder, officers whose names made the blood of youth beat faster, survivors of incredible dangers. One by one they quietly die by their own hand. Some do it in obscure lodging-houses, some in their office, where they seem to be carrying on their business like other men. Some slip over a vessel's side and disappear into the sea. When Claude's mother hears of these things, she shudders and presses her hands tight over her breast, as if she had him there. She feels as if God had saved him from some horrible suffering, some horrible end. For as she reads, she thinks those slayers of themselves were all so like him. They were the ones who had hoped extravagantly, who in order to do what they did had to hope extravagantly, and to believe passionately. And they found they had hoped and believed too much. But one she knew, who could ill bear disillusion. Safe. Safe. Mahailey, when they are alone, sometimes addresses Mrs. Wheeler as Mudder. "Now, Mudder, you go upstairs and lay down and rest yourself." Mrs. Wheeler knows that then she is thinking of Claude, is speaking for Claude. As they are working at the table or bending over the oven, something reminds them of him, and they think of him together, like one person. Mahailey will pat her back and say, "Never you mind, Mudder, you'll see your boy up yonder." Mrs. Wheeler always feels that God is near, but Mahailey is not troubled by any knowledge of interstellar spaces, and for her he is nearer still, directly overhead, not so very far above the kitchen stove. This is the end of One of Ours, by Willa Cather. Recording by Tom Weiss.